My name is Ethan Cross, and I have a brother who doesn't exist. At least, that's what the records say. I grew up in a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, the golden child of a tech billionaire who had built his empire on data mining and surveillance. My father, Julian Cross, was a legend, a man who had predicted the rise of social media, who had turned ones and zeros into a fortune that could buy small countries. He was also a ghost. He never spoke about his past. He never showed us photographs of his childhood. He never introduced us to his family. It was as if he had been born the day he founded his company, and everything before that had been erased. I never questioned it. I was too busy being the heir, the prodigy, the son who would inherit everything. But then my father died, and the secrets began to surface. The first secret was a photograph. I found it hidden in the lining of his old briefcase, a faded Polaroid of two young boys, no older than 10, standing in front of a dilapidated farmhouse. They were identical, same eyes, same smile, same messy brown hair. One of them was my father, the other was a ghost. I confronted my mother, a woman who had spent 40 years as the perfect corporate wife. She looked at the photograph, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. "That's your father's twin brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "His name was Daniel. He died before you were born, and you are never, ever to speak of him again." I didn't listen. I couldn't. I had spent my entire life believing I knew my father, but I had only known a shadow. The real story, the one he had buried, was waiting to be uncovered, and it would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family, my legacy, and my own identity. The investigation began with a single name: Daniel Cross. I hired a private investigator named Sarah Bennett, a former FBI agent who had made a career out of unearthing buried truths. Sarah was tough, relentless, and she had a personal stake in the case. Her own father had been ruined by Julian Cross's company decades ago. She didn't trust me, but she trusted my money, and she was the only person I could turn to. We started with the public records. There were none. Daniel Cross had been erased from every database, every archive, every document. It was as if he had never existed. But Sarah found a trail. A birth certificate from a small town in Kansas, a school record that had been sealed, a police report that had been buried so deep it took us 3 months to dig it out. The police report was the key. It described a fire that had destroyed the farmhouse where the twins grew up. Their parents had died in the blaze. Only one child had survived. The report identified the survivor as Julian Cross. Daniel Cross was listed as missing, presumed dead. But the report was dated a full year after the photograph was taken. Daniel had been alive long after the fire. He had been hidden, protected, and eventually erased. The question was, why? Sarah found the answer in a sealed court document, a file that had been marked classified by a judge who had since disappeared. The document revealed that Daniel Cross had not died in the fire. He had been institutionalized, declared insane, and locked away in a facility that no longer existed. Julian had been the one who signed the commitment papers. He had testified that his brother was dangerous, that he started the fire, that he was a threat to society. But the truth, as we would soon discover, was far more terrifying. I visited the facility, or what was left of it. It was a crumbling ruin on the outskirts of a dying town, a place that had been abandoned for decades. The records were gone, but the walls still held their secrets. In a hidden room behind a false wall, I found a diary. Daniel's diary. It was filled with rage, with pain, with a love that had been twisted into something dark. Daniel had been the quiet twin, the one who had stayed on the farm while Julian built his empire. He had been the caretaker of their parents, the one who had nursed them through their final illnesses. And he had discovered something that Julian had tried to bury. Their father was not their biological father. They were the children of a different man, a man who had been Julian's mentor and rival. The secret had destroyed the family. The fire had been set by their mother, a woman driven mad by the weight of the truth. She had killed herself and their father, and she had tried to kill her sons. Daniel had saved Julian. He had pulled him from the flames, and Julian had repaid him by locking him away. The diary was a confession, a testament to a life that had been stolen. But it was also a map. Daniel had hidden something that Julian had spent his life trying to find. The key to the empire, the proof of the crime, the truth that would bring Julian Cross down. I found the hidden object in the basement of the farmhouse, a place I had never visited. It was a safe, rusted and ancient, buried beneath the rubble of the fire. Inside was a single item, a USB drive. The drive contained a file, a document that Julian had spent his entire life trying to destroy. It was a confession, not Daniel's confession, Julian's. Julian had not been the innocent survivor. He had been the architect of the fire. He had set the blaze, killed his parents, and framed his twin. He had used his brother's supposed madness as a cover for his own crimes. Daniel had been innocent all along. He had been a victim, a scapegoat, a ghost who had been erased from history. I sat in the basement for hours, staring at the confession. My father was a murderer. My legacy was a lie. My entire life had been built on the suffering of the man who should have been my uncle. The revenge, I realized, was not mine to take. It was Daniel's, and Daniel was still alive. I found Daniel in a small town in Oregon, living under a false identity. He was an old man now, his face lined with age, his eyes hollow with decades of pain. He didn't recognize me at first, but when I showed him the diary, the confession, the proof of his innocence, he wept. He wept like a child. I never thought anyone would find me, he said. I never thought anyone would believe me. I told him everything about the inheritance, the empire, the lies. I told him that I was not the heir. He was. He was the rightful owner of the cross fortune. He was the one who should have inherited everything. Daniel shook his head. I don't want the money. I don't want the empire. I just want the truth. I want the world to know what he did to me. And so we gave it to them. We released the confession to every major news outlet. We exposed the lies, the crimes, the cover-up. The Cross Empire crumbled. My mother was arrested. The board was indicted. And Daniel, the ghost, finally stepped into the light. He was celebrated as a hero, a victim who had survived against all odds. But he was also broken. The years of isolation, of silence, of being erased from existence had taken their toll. He died 6 months later, surrounded by the family he had never known. And I, Ethan Cross, became the guardian of his legacy. Not the fortune, not the empire, the truth. The aftermath was brutal. The Cross name became a curse, a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked power. I was disowned by my remaining family, hounded by the press, and stripped of every connection to the empire I had been raised to inherit. But I didn't care. I had found something far more valuable than money. I had found my true family. Daniel had left me a letter, a final message that he had written on his deathbed. It was addressed to me, the nephew he had never met. Ethan, I spent my entire life being erased. I was a footnote in someone else's story, a ghost that no one remembered. But you found me. You brought me back, and for that I am grateful. The empire was never mine, but the truth is, and I leave it to you. I read the letter 100 times, each time feeling the weight of his words. The truth was the only inheritance that mattered, and I would carry it for the rest of my life. I sold the remaining assets of the Cross Empire and donated the proceeds to mental health facilities, to victims of institutional abuse, to the causes that Daniel had cared about. I built a new life, a life that was mine. I never spoke of the Cross name again, but I never forgot Daniel, and I never forgot the lesson he had taught me. That revenge is not about destruction, it's about redemption. And redemption, in the end, is the only thing worth fighting for. Years later, I stood in front of the farmhouse in Kansas, the place where it all began. It had been rebuilt, transformed into a museum dedicated to the story of Daniel Cross. Visitors came from all over the world to learn about the twin who had been erased, the man who had been silenced, the truth that had finally been told. I walked through the exhibits, reading the letters, watching the videos, feeling the presence of the man who had changed my life, and I whispered, "Thank you. Not for the inheritance, not for the fortune, for the truth that had set us both free. The twin who never appeared in records had finally found his place in history, and I, the heir who had been raised on lies, had found mine. The revenge was not against my father, it was against the silence that had consumed our family, and in breaking that silence, we had both won. The story of Daniel and Julian Cross became a cautionary tale, a legend about the cost of secrets and the power of redemption. But for me, it was something simpler. A beginning I had never thought I deserved, and a future I would build with my own hands, one truth at a time. The mansion in the Hamptons stood empty now, a monument to a dynasty that had crumbled, but in its place a new legacy had risen, a legacy of truth, of justice, of the twin who had finally been seen. And that, in the end, was the most powerful revenge of all.